In this video we discuss cubic unit cells. Alright, we have said that solids pack their atoms so that those atoms are occupying sites in a lattice. Okay, a lattice is simply a geometric representation of the three-dimensional solid that we're looking at. Now, something that is quite interesting is to try to reduce the lattice, which is again a macroscopic object, into the simplest representation that replicated can still produce the lattice. So that is what we call the unit cell. It is the simplest representation of a lattice from which you can generate the lattice simply by replication. Now, there's many types of unit cells, but we're only going to be discussing here the simplest ones, which are cubic unit cells. To generate a lattice from a cubic unit cell, the only thing you have to do is take the unit cell and just replicate it in the three directions of space, x, y, and z, and then the units of the replication, so how far you move one image from the next one, is going to be exactly the same in the three directions of space. Alright, so there's going to be three types of cubic unit cells, and we're going to discuss each of them qualitatively in this video, and then in further videos we'll take a look at a much more detailed level at those individual unit cells. Alright, so the simplest cubic unit cell is called the simple cubic unit cell, which is this one. Right, so notice that that's the simplest way that you can have a cubic unit cell and still be able to obtain a solid via replication in the three axes of space. Okay, so again, that's the simplest one. We're going to call this a simple cubic cell. Alright, so one of the questions that we can ask is, well, how many atoms do you have in the simple units cubic cell? Right, so notice that in this case we have that that unit cell, right, has atoms at the corners of the cube. All right, but if we actually then try to calculate how many of these atoms belong outright to the unit cell, then the calculus changes a little bit. Right, notice that this corner that you have right here is shared by another cell right here, so that is 2, and then you have another one right here, 3, 4, and so forth. If you start to count, you actually have that only 1/8 of the sphere of this atom that belongs belongs outright to the unit cell. Right, again, because you actually have 8 cubes that are nearest neighbors with this one, this atom is shared by 8 unit cells, and that means that only 1/8 of this atom belongs outright to just one of the unit cells. Right, because a cube has 8 corners, and 1/8 of each corner belongs to the unit cell, then in total there's actually only one atom, only one sphere that belongs to this unit cell. Okay, so the number of spheres in the entire unit cell for a simple cubic unit cell is this one. Right, so this is just one of the cubic unit cells, but there's 2 more that we're going to see. Okay, the next one is what we called the body-centered cubic unit cell. Right, so what we have right here is the same thing. We have a cube, and that is a cubic unit cell, right? And then you have atoms in the corners of the unit cell. And however, right in the middle of the unit cell, there is another atom, right? So that is a little different from the simple cubic unit cell, which we have here, in that there is an atom in the middle of the cube, and in the simple cubic unit cell, there's no atoms, right? So we can repeat the calculation and then figure out how many atoms belong outright to the unit cell. Again, much as before, each of the corners is shared by 8 cubes, and what that means is that only 1/8 of the atoms in the corners belong to the unit cell. So we'll have that from the corners, you will actually have, this is called a body-centered unit cell. From the corners, you will have one atom, and then there's one in the middle that is not shared with any other cubes nearby, right? Any other unit cells, right? So that actually belongs outright to the unit cell. So then you have one in the center, and that tells you that you have 2 atoms in the unit cell for a body-centered cubic cell. All right, so there's one more that we're going to see, and that is going to be a face-centered cubic unit cell. All right, this is going to be the most efficient packed unit cell of the 3, And it actually comes from one of the closest packed structures that we have studied in a prior video. Okay, so let's try to see if we can build this face-centered cubic unit cell. Okay, so here we have our most efficiently packed spheres in one layer. Okay, notice that this atom right there has 6 nearest neighbors, and that is the most efficient packing in a layer. And then when you put these 2 layers together, this can be grown to generate either a cubic closest packed structure or a hexagonal closest packed structure. We're interested here in the cubic one, and that unit cell simply can be completed by capping those 2 layers with 2 atoms, and that gives you your face-centered cubic unit cell. Right, so how is this different from the body-centered and the simple one? Okay, what you have right here is that the corners of your unit cell are still occupied by 1 sphere. Okay, in the simple cubic cell, there were no other spheres. In the body-centered unit cell, you had a sphere right in the middle of the cube. In this face-centered unit cell, what you actually have is spheres in each one of the faces. Okay, so if we turn this around, there's another sphere right in that face, another sphere that in that face. Okay, that is 4, and then 5, and 6. Alright, so that is your face-centered cubic unit cell, and we can still calculate how many atoms or spheres belong outright to this unit cell. Okay, so we have that the corners are shared by 8 other cubes, right? So that actually gives you 1/8 of the sphere belongs to the unit cell outright, and because you have 8 corners, that is going to be 1 atom just from the corners. And then you have the faces, right? So the question is, well, these atoms that are in the faces of the unit cell, how are they shared with other unit cells? Notice that if you're in the face of the unit cell, this atom right here, only half of it belongs to this unit cell, the other half will belong to the unit cell to the right of this one, right? So that means that each of the spheres in the faces, only half of that belongs to the unit cell. And because we have 6 faces in a cube, then there will be a total of 3 atoms coming from those faces, right? So in this face-centered unit cubic cell, you have 1 sphere from the corners and then 3 from the faces. You get a total of 4 atoms in the unit cell. Okay, and again, just to close this off, remember that this face-centered cubic unit cell, if you replicate this in 3 dimensions, then you get to the cubic closest packed lattice, which is one of the 2 most efficient ways to pack atoms in lattice. Right, so in this video we have taken a qualitative view at cubic unit cells, and we've seen that there's 3 of them: simple, body-centered, and face-centered. Of those, the face-centered is the one that is more efficient, and it's also the one that presents more atoms in the unit cell. In the next videos, we're going to do more quantitative calculations of things like the density of atoms in one of these cubic cells and things similar to those.